Today I'm joined by Dr. Gearóid Ó Cuinn, who is the founding director of the Global Legal Action Network, or GLAN, where he is responsible for GLAN's legal actions and strategic growth. He's also an adjunct lecturer at the Irish Centre for Human Rights in Galway and formerly lectured at Lancaster University Law School and was a visiting fellow at the Transnational Law Institute at King's College London. The Global Legal Action Network, GLAN, is a unique non-profit organisation that works with affected communities to pursue innovative legal actions across borders, challenging states and other powerful actors involved with systemic injustice. Their vision is justice across borders. So it's a great opportunity to have Gearóid on the podcast and to explore GLAN in more detail. Now, just have a look at the GLAN website. We give details in the show notes and at the end. And listen to Gearóid take us through some of the GLAN legal actions and significant findings. It really is the tip of the iceberg in terms of the organisation's work today, but we do get a good snapshot of what they do. There's also some great advice for anyone interested in international law, several aspects of it, and information on how to get involved in GLAN and support their work. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Hello everybody and welcome to today's episode of the Activist Lawyer podcast. I am delighted to be joined in the studio via Zoom, based in Galway, by Dr. Gearóid Ó Cuinn. Hi Gearóid, thank you for joining me.
Hi, nice to be here, sir.
Brilliant. Well, we've been following your work for some time, the organisation that you're going to talk about today, and you've been very active of late, but we're going to go back in time, firstly, to where it all began for you. And I know we had spent a little bit of time in the same institution back in Galway many years ago when you were studying law there. But I guess what motivated you to pursue law as a career, and really how did your focus on human rights come into play?
Yeah, I think I first became interested in, I was only reflecting on this recently. I became interested for a number of different angles, I think, informed my view and my motivation. Early on, I was exposed to the the De La Salle brothers. I went to De La Salle primary school and secondary school in Waterford, and they would regularly bring back stories from the missions. And once a year, we'd raise money for Katui Week. Waterford, the name water in the name was part of a fundraising drive for water in Katui, I believe in Kenya. So there's always this awareness of really compelling and shocking stories from overseas and deep inequalities that contrasted with our lives. And that's probably not the most fashionable origin story, but it was definitely a big influence. And also film. I think I remember from one of the video shops in Waterford renting back in the day where you'd have to rent the entire video player with the video. And one of the first movies I saw on that was, I think it was called Emerald Forest. And it was about this child who'd been kidnapped by an indigenous group, and then a dam was threatening their way of life, and they sent him back into the white community to get help from his biological father. And this blew my mind, but then later on, definitely I was studying in the United States, and I was always interested in, definitely from current affairs, especially. I think my father was a big influence on that. He's a newsman. He consumes an incredible, voracious appetite, and always made me aware of things that were going on. And when the invasion of Iraq happened while I was studying in the US, I realized I had a different politics to everyone around me. There was sort of an awakening. And that led me on a journey to my supervisor at the time. I was a biologist. I was doing a doctorate over there, and she gave me permission to listen in on law classes in the School of Law in the University of Notre Dame. And there, Juan Mendez, famous human rights lawyer, survivor of torture himself, was giving classes on international humanitarian law. So I got to grips with the Geneva Conventions, and it was an amazing journey. I was hooked from that point on. I was like, this is what I want to do, and became far more interested in current affairs, politics, and law.
Very good. And of course, your work has that kind of global aspect to it as well. I'm wondering, for listeners who might not be familiar with GLAN, you might share a little bit about what the organisation is all about and perhaps the services you provide and the overall mission of GLAN.
Yeah, GLAN stands for the Global Legal Action Network. We were, I suppose, very interested in the early days, around the time we were setting up, of looking to see if we could practice law in a different way. I suppose in getting to how we came about, first of all, maybe I should rewind. I became very interested. I'd volunteered out in the occupied territories, occupied Palestinian territory and the Syrian Golan. And I had seen how complicity, I could see how the Irish economy was linked to what was happening on the ground. Irish cement was pouring into the separation barrier, the apartheid wall as it's known, closing Palestinians off from their land and their water supplies. You could see other forms of complicity that really weren't being addressed. And at the same time, a really interesting phenomenon out there was the NGOization of the pushback and resistance to occupation, that foreigners were coming in and dropping in for a few months, getting experience and leaving. It was a slightly extractive process, I felt. And I felt there was more legitimacy in questioning the way in which Ireland was connected to these serious human rights violations and violations of international law. And that started me on a journey of thinking across borders. How could we address this? And one of the first things I became interested in was the package holiday industry, and how tours to the Holy Land were advertised to consumers who didn't realize they were visiting illegal settlements that were displacing Palestinians. And I felt it was a consumer law issue. So this was a way to bring Irish law into contact with something that was otherwise distant, and created a reckoning, or demanded an alignment to find out if these things were consistent with our standards. And that was a sort of into thinking in a transnational way. And it quickly became apparent, especially when setting up an initial pilot to try and raise funds to do this type of work, that there wasn't many people thinking along those lines, especially in Ireland. And I ended up re-establishing this as an organization in the UK, along with two good long-time friends and colleagues of mine, Yanis Kalkouzos and Paul Clark, and Jerry Liston, to start to turn this into a systematic approach, a practice. And so what we do now is we work with communities affected by powerful actors who are inflicting or entangled with serious human rights abuses and environmental harms. And we pursue legal actions against those actors across borders, and working in solidarity with those communities. And we really strive to break new ground, to be innovative and nimble, and to take on the big questions of our day, and to see how we can unlock the power of law, recognizing it is oftentimes part of the problem. It protects power, but we do hold out a hope and an enthusiasm that law can function to challenge power and short circuit the status quo, and that we can create spaces for change.
And just in terms of the structure, I mean, I'm thinking of the global aspect of it too. How does it work in terms of lawyers contributing to that work? What type of team do you have to support? Do you collaborate with other organisations, for example?
Speaking about the team, we're currently about 22 strong, and we took on our first full-time staff member in late 2018. So we've gone through a period of rapid growth, and I think we've managed to attract highly motivated, capable, talented people who are committed to this line of work. They eat, sleep, and drink it. It is something that I think they find extremely rewarding, and they're bought into the mission. And I think their creativity and ability to collaborate is what drives this. And by collaborate, I mean they actively engage with a wide variety of partners who bring an array of different skill sets to bear, because each case is unique and has its own demands. In some situations, it's deep expertise on climate change science. In other times, it's dealing with how best to preserve open source information. Other times, it's cultural know-how and contacts on the ground, people who can unlock stories, access to communities and local expertise. So it's an extremely creative process that requires a deep commitment to collaboration to allow us to reach beyond our offices here in London and Galway to connect and make these things happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the years, you and your team, I mean, you've been at the forefront of some of the global legal actions. You've touched on a few there, mainly challenging states and, of course, other powerful actors involved in systemic injustice across communities and countries. Can you maybe highlight some of your most significant successes? I've read a little bit about you have a great website as well that goes through some of the various different issues that you tackle. But in your opinion, what has kind of stands out for you as, to date being a real success and achievement for the organisation?
Happy to. I think a lot of some of our key cases sort of came to the surface over the last 12 months. They've been many years in development, and of course then you file your case, and it takes a good deal of time to come to a conclusion. And I think last year was really incredible. We were before the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights as part of an ambitious climate change case against 32 states, where we supported 6 young people from Portugal who were living through really severe climate change impacts already within their lifetime. And it was an opportunity to challenge the failure of these states to enact sufficiently ambitious greenhouse gas cuts emissions, and allowed us to really put forward some ambitious creative arguments on how they should be responding to the climate crisis and engaging the court to try and seek a legally binding decision that would compel them to act with greater urgency as demanded by the climate science. And, just for your listeners, the type of impacts that these young people are projected to experience are quite shocking. It's anticipated they will be exposed to heat waves that would last a month or more, topping 40 degrees Celsius, effectively making it difficult for them to spend time outdoors, to exercise, to sleep, to study. All of those basic things would be short-circuited. And similarly, the risks that come with these extreme heat waves, including forest fires, and that was how we sort of became aware of these young people, was as a result of really devastating forest fires of 2016-17, I believe, which resulted in the deaths of at least 160 people. And it brought it to their doorstep. They realized that their world was on a very particular trajectory. It is recognized, Portugal, as one of the climate hotspots of Europe. So they're experiencing things ahead of time and have less ability to adapt compared to other North European countries. So it was an amazing journey between filing the case and getting to the Grand Chamber. It took a great deal of creative work led by our senior lawyer, Jerry Liston, who was at the forefront of understanding this really complex interaction between the science and the law, and establishing the obligations of states therein, and the practicalities of ensuring that the young people and their families were engaged and active in the case, that they understood what was happening, and that we respected their agency and voice, because they had a lot to say. They were very much the people who were, as I said, were at the front lines. And likewise, we had to figure out how to finance and fundraise for all of this. And we embarked on crowdfunding and various different strategies to make it happen. And again, our case was heard at the same time as the Swiss elders case, the Venus and Urine. And on the morning, Greta Thunberg joined us, and we were all brought into a separate chamber. and went in to receive the decision. And yeah, history was made that day, albeit on the Swiss case. Ours was declared inadmissible, but it was very clear that in joining us, that the court was, a lot of the arguments put forward had influenced the court, had accepted that the 1.5 degrees of temperature warming is, the upper limit of what states should be working to, and had borrowed from our arguments around overseas emissions, which is really important because it's not just the territorial emissions. European states, as you know, are constantly using and benefiting from value chains that result in massive amounts of emissions overseas, and that these should be factored in. So it was a momentous day, an intergenerational struggle as well between the young and the elders of Switzerland, the youth of Portugal and the elders, and to see that come to fruition was an incredible, a life moment for me anyway, and I'm sure for our team who worked diligently on the case. And later that summer, a second major win for us was the Court of Appeal decision, where it was held that the UK Crime and Customs authorities had not treated, or should have treated, cotton produced through forced labour as falling within the scope of the Proceeds of Crime Act. So this was a case involving the Uyghur minority of China. And the Uyghur minority have been subject to effectively genocide and forced labour. They are put into large prison camps, and adjacent to those prison camps are oftentimes manufacturing facilities that engage in products like tomato-based foods, solar panels, and cotton textiles. And we were querying why these types of textiles produced through forced labour were flowing freely through our borders and onto our markets. And we argued that these were the proceeds of crime, atrocity crimes. And yeah, the Court of Appeal accepted those arguments and asked that the government really take a decision accepting that they do fall within these domestic laws, and that when they are notified, they ought to investigate and potentially halt such goods. And it's a serious implications for the industry, because anyone who's involved in handling those proceeds of crime, be it in transferring, concealing, or moving, or otherwise, is committing their own secondary offence under criminal law. So it completely changes the risk profile, I think, for people engaged in that market. So there are two big things that happened last year, and there's more I could go on with, but maybe I'll pause there.
Yeah, I mean, we can have a look at that. I just, with the Clemus you're in case we had Mark Willers, Kessie, on talking about that. And I mean, you do get this real sense of, I don't know, it's very encouraging to see young people as well. And you mentioned the Portugal case there too, coming together and being supported by organisations like yourselves and other partners that you work with, to really bring these cases. It's brave to do it, but as you said, even the references that are made have such wide, far-reaching consequences globally, and we saw that with other guests we've had on sharing their experiences with climate justice cases as well. So we're at a very pivotal and an exciting moment in that area of the law. So it's great to hear about that. Now, over the years since your organisation started, but particularly over the last 15 months, GLAN's work around Gaza and the broader Palestinian struggle has been highly impactful. And I've been following some of the cases and the updates that you've had in terms of taking legal actions. Can you take us through what's been happening maybe around the last 12 months or so in terms of the legal action you've been taking, particularly with regards to the UK government?
Absolutely. We've been, I suppose, since our inception, we've always been looking at Palestine, because it is I think it's like the canary in the mine. The experience of the Palestinian people is indicative of commitments to the rule of law, double standards, and also developments in terms of repressive policies and mechanisms, from surveillance technologies to the use of artificial intelligence. And as part of this, my longtime colleague and friend Derval Minogue had been looking at targeting practices of the Israeli military in Gaza prior to October 7th, and the manner in which entire high rises would be flattened with heavy munitions on the basis that a single room was connected to someone who was involved in militancy, for example. And it really called into question the targeting practices and their compliance with international law. And we were ready to roll with a complaint almost prior to, in the lead up to October 7th, on this basis, where we were looking at the supply of British weaponry to the Israelis. They are a major supplier of munitions behind the likes of Germany and US, who are definitely the sort of lead suppliers. And building on our work in Yemen, where the Saudi-led coalition had been involved in decimating the civilian infrastructure, using British weaponry and training and service provision in their fighter jets. We were taking those lessons and trying to apply them in the context of Palestine. And when October 7th happened, it was immediately clear in the rhetoric of all levels of Israeli society, the upper echelons of the military and civilian government, that there was a strong risk of genocide, as indicated by the many statements of the military and the manner in which it was conducting hostilities in Gaza. So you'll be aware that the Palestinian people were being labeled as human animals, and that a complete siege was ordered, cutting off electricity, water, and medicines, and that this was immediately becoming a situation of collective punishment, coming on foot of years of siege on Gaza, which itself is a breach of international law. And so I think within 2 to 3 weeks, we had filed information with the government pointing to this occurrence and pointing to the disproportionate and indiscriminate attacks on Gaza and its infrastructure and its civilian population, and said that there is a clear risk of international humanitarian law being breached, and therefore, under the regime governing arms export licenses, that these licenses ought to be suspended on the basis that there is this really strong risk that international humanitarian law would be breached. And this led us on a very extensive journey, a back and forth, trying to keep the case on track, because the government did its very best to derail it, and to keep the weapons flowing, and also securing information on how this process was actually working in real time, and publicizing it. And I think our case was one of the few windows into the arms licensing system and the export of licenses during this, the export of weaponry during this time. And we exposed such things as David Cameron, who was then the Foreign Secretary, signing off on arms exports to Israel just days after Israeli drones had hunted down the international aid workers with World Central Kitchen and had even killed some British nationals, and that international law was being filtered out, and the risk associated with those violations were being deliberately filtered out, so that we were left with decisions that were inadequate and in contravention of the law. And this was the basis for this judicial review process that we were engaged in. And in September of this year, and again, I think this is another highlight of our work, as I said, which is led by Derval Minogue and many other colleagues, was the suspension of 30 arms licenses. And these were arms licenses that were encompassed munitions and weaponry used in direct hostilities. And 4 hours ahead of going into court, David Lammy stood up in Parliament to announce those suspensions, but made a very important exception, and that was for the parts for the F-35 fighter jet, which continue to be exported to the US. I believe they're assembled in Texas. There's multiple countries that supply, and then it's sent to Israel. And this is really important, because the F-35 is the warplane that drops the colossal 2,000-pound bombs. These have a kill radius of about 58 football fields, and they're dropped in highly densely populated areas. And they've also, it's been documented by Danish researchers, have dropped these bombs on tented so-called safe zones, where there's absolutely zero protection from the families sheltering there. And people are simply vaporized by these massive munitions. The craters they leave are visible from space, so the number of bombs that have been dropped can literally be measured from satellites. And when you look, CNN did a really amazing study just showing at the intensity of the bombing and the catastrophic injuries and deaths that it creates. It really points to a direct connection between these, atrocities and ultimately genocide, which even the International Court of Justice has said there is a plausible risk that this is the case, and that was way back in the earlier part of 24, and things got a lot worse since that decision, including with we saw the withholding of food supplies from the civilian population. So in short, the case is ongoing, and we anticipate we'll have a final hearing on the F-35 hopefully very soon. We're waiting for a decision of the court today, in fact, and hopefully we'll have a date on that F-35 exemption.
That F-35. Well, it's interesting there. You did mention, your case has really given a window into this licensing system and weapons licensing system, along with other journalists, investigative journalists who have exposed, for example, the routes from RAF planes taken off from Cyprus as well through Gaza, presumably the same jets. So we have that information. Your case has exposed so much, and others around the world as well who've been taken similar cases before their governments, in terms of that connection that you make, that direct connection. But my question is really, in terms of complicity, state complicity and accountability, when we mention this or when we talk about it, people on the ground don't want to hear about that. I feel like there's a sense of blinkers going on when you make that connection to Gaza and other places where a state has been, as you can explain, and through your case you will have evidence to do that direct link. But what can happen? What kind of accountability can we see? Or is this something that will just be buried again, as it has been in the past, when we, could assert complicity and link it to other wars and other conflicts that have been going on?
Yeah, I think in the first instance, these cases highlight a gross double standard, which is uncomfortable for governments who do want to bury this and hope that it goes away. I'm not sure that many supporting and complicit governments like the UK anticipated how long things would go on in Gaza and how bad they would get. But it was clear, it became that there should have been no illusions after sort of 3 months in that Israel was here to do one thing. Its stated goal of turning Gaza flattening it, turning it into a city of tents and forcing people into the desert. So they were explicit in their intent. And so any deniability quickly evaporates. Yeah. And governments chose, despite the evidence, despite the International Court of Justice, chose to continue supporting these states. This state, the Israeli state and its military, in their effectively hoping to eradicate the Palestinian population from Gaza. And what we witness as a part of this is, the inadequacies of the legal options available to us when it comes to accountability. Judicial review is a very particular technical process. It's quite protracted. It doesn't really respond to the urgency of the situation when you've got mass starvation and famine being inflicted and enforced through the targeting of the infrastructure, and enforced through the decimation of the aid infrastructure by British supplied weapons and warplanes. But at the very least, what we were able to start teasing out as part of this is something that can be latched onto, I think, by lawyers in the longer term. Yeah. So, for example, we showed and I think this was central to the triggering of the suspension of those weaponry, of those 30 arms licenses. We showed that information obtained through torture, the torture of Palestinians, including ambulance workers and medics, the type of questions they were asked during that torture about the presence of fighters, information obtained through torture, people will say anything to halt torture, and it contaminates, it makes it unreliable. And this was the basis on which targeting was occurring on medical facilities and ambulances. And assurances given to third countries like the UK were also contaminated. They were like, we're acting on the basis of intelligence. And we accept those assurances despite evidence and despite the Red Cross not being allowed in to inspect these prisons and make sure that this isn't happening. So it exposes these systematic failures, and I think we bottom out the system and show that it's broken, and that's something to work with. Then there is accountability for the perpetrators and those who are complicit, and I would hope to see that the likes of David Cameron and others who enabled these weapons to flow, despite all of the stark warnings and the blatant violations of international humanitarian law, which were evident to anyone who turned on their TV screens each night. It was traumatic to watch. I would hope that lawyers begin to examine the complicity of such actors and that they themselves are targeted. And we are seeing as well international networks appearing who are targeting IDF soldiers, dual nationals who are traveling or returning to other countries, being targeted in countries like Brazil, Morocco, Belgium, France, and other locations. Really emphasizing, I think, and reflecting a thirst for accountability and for a change to the status quo. And I think there is a struggle here between the powers that want this suppressed and don't even want people to speak out on it. And we see how protesters are treated. And again, a double standard there, versus if you're advocating for the Ukrainians, you'd have a different treatment and experience. And similarly, Trump now I've seen is talking about deporting people who have been involved in pro-Palestinian protests on campus in the US. There is a definite attempt to suppress, but at the same time, there is a significant, increasingly sophisticated pushback of different organizations getting together and saying this should not stand. This is, and I think it speaks to not leaving the system, not ceding ground, and not ceding international law to these powerful actors, that there is an importance to engage and to call into question and expose double standards and play the long game. These are not fights that are won in the short term, unfortunately. But I do think Palestine has demanded, and the situation in Gaza has demanded that we do that. And I think there is a huge amount of energy there now to try and change things in the longer term. And if that is the case, there is a chance that this could be a watershed moment for international law if we all sort of row in that direction. That I think the mask has slipped in terms of how these power systems work and how resilient they are, but and I don't think people are comfortable with them anymore.
And that was going to be my question around international law and how decisions from the ICJ and the ICC would support your case, of course. But I guess it's that feeling of people feeling discouraged and disheartened when we don't see state actors comply with such judgments and rulings and dismiss them, basically, and still engage with people who have been, announced as war criminals with ICC warrants out for their arrest, and it's kind of pushed to one side. So you can see how people are becoming frustrated at the system. But we have had Palestinian lawyers who've been on the podcast who, like yourself, have noticed, well, these are significant changes. They're groundbreaking, and it can only be a positive snapshot of, as you said, a watershed moment. And I hope that, as you say, we can kind of push forward in that direction because it's hugely important work. And yes, we need to hold on to the system that we have and make sure that it works and it's fit for purpose. And just in terms, you mentioned Ukraine there, I know that you have been working on, you've also mentioned alleged atrocity crimes. How has that played out in terms of maybe comparing it with your work in the occupied territories?
Yes, again, starting with our work in Yemen, and again, this is work led by my colleague Dervin Minogue, we were really interested in open source information as a source of legal evidence when dealing with atrocity crimes and war crimes. And the question around how this evidence could be made admissible or increasing its admissibility so that it could be used in accountability mechanisms. And I think it was recognition that, the world has changed. Mobile phone penetration has, reached most parts of the globe. And in conflicts where, like in Yemen, where again, a famine was triggered by the Saudi-led coalition armed by the West, had a devastating impact on civilian life and civilian infrastructure. And we saw the targeting of journalists, very similar again to what we've seen in Gaza. It really, those restrictions, that siege, the information flow that created meant that we were reliant on open source intelligence to establish that something had happened. It's not enough to claim it has happened. You have to demonstrate it. And oftentimes those Yemenis who've taken a video can't make it to court in a foreign jurisdiction like Britain to assert when and where something was taken and certify and provide authorship. And so the question around admissibility of open source evidence was something we really sought to pioneer in terms of developing a methodology. And we work closely with the investigative NGO Bellingcat, who are experts. We formed a justice and accountability unit and hosted some mock trials where a sitting judge and opposing counsel would argue over the admissibility of a piece of footage. And that led us to, there was always an awful lot of high-level principles on how you should treat this evidence and what you should do, but in terms of the practicalities and making it workable, this is where I really think our methodology broke new ground. It became a gold standard for that. And I know those mock trial videos are used now in training in the UN and countries around the world. And with Ukraine, we felt that there was a role for this here, especially with the attacks on civilian targets or civilians and civilian infrastructure being captured in open source information, that we could provide training to Ukrainian judges and prosecutors to ensure that they were equipped to gather in the right way, so that accountability efforts would stand up through in court or other forums. It was interesting to be on both, have a foot in both conflicts in a way, because it gave us, I think it gave us a voice. In the sense that we were calling for consistency, and that in the situation in Ukraine, an organization like us as well have to be careful not to be co-opted by Western interests and to be instrumentalized. And I think with our work on Palestine and Yemen, we were very much going against the grain.
Right.
And as an NGO stepping in both camps, you really feel the difference. It's far easier to fundraise for things that go in alignment with Western hegemonic interests, and much more difficult when you go against the grain. And similarly, you are struck by the double standards, especially around the right to resist occupation, how countries understand what action they can take. With the Ukraine, there was active, willing, proactive enforcement of sanctions, and attempts, and even leading to reform of certain government agencies, resourcing of other authorities, and addressing the ability of Russians to silence dissent through slap injunctions in UK courts. That those things came under scrutiny and there was reform. Whereas in Palestine, the opposite would happen. And you only have to look at things like the duty to prevent and how the UK would interpret it. They would say, okay, there's a risk of genocide here. The Genocide Convention's clear. It says we have a duty to prevent this. But then they'd say, well, it's not for us to determine whether there's a genocide and whether we should prevent it. We should wait for an appropriate court like the International Court of Justice, knowing that case would take 5 to 6 years before anything is ever determined, therefore rendering the duty to prevent meaningless. Yeah. So this was their way of signaling that law matters, but actually doing nothing, and meanwhile continuing to arm an actor who has no track record in respecting international law. And the one thing I would just leave you with on that is our case exposed this in court. The court documents have shown that the UK has accepted that Israel is not willing to comply with international law, has not committed to complying with international law, and that they have no red lines. The UK has no red lines. There's nothing that Israel could do now that would cause them to suspend exports of F-35. So it's a glaring double standard, and I think that our ability to speak from both sides of that experience shows that we're consistent and that we're seeking consistency.
God, it is. It's glaring and it's incredibly frustrating. But again, you know, it's fantastic to see that your cases are exposing that in the work that GLAN and your partners that you mentioned there as well. Just moving on a little bit, I mean, obviously a lot of your work, or I'm presumably you work very much with grassroots campaigners as well. I'm thinking maybe particularly around the climate justice work. And I'm wondering, just in terms of, the title of our podcast, Activist Lawyer, it's a question we ask a lot of our guests around activism and the law working hand in hand, and how this might bring about real change. What's your opinion on that dynamic playing out in what you've seen in your own career?
Yeah, I studying law, I had a sort of an enthusiasm that was ultimately rooted in this idea that you could use law to change things. I think that's why most people, they may have, oftentimes we're influenced by what we see on our screens, and we're inspired to go down that route. And, I was definitely inspired by the likes of Garrett Pierce, who represented the Birmingham Six, and Rosemary Nelson as well, who was assassinated in the North, for her work in representing people. And so you're confronted then, I think, with, you go from this position of enthusiasm to confronting the real politic of where law and society meets. And you understand quickly, or you can either go one of two ways. You can become jaded, partially because you fail to manage your expectations, or you can become more sophisticated and dogged. And I chose the latter because it definitely becomes clear that law is not the answer. You figure that out early on. Then you realize that law is just one form of mobilization. And going back to what I was saying earlier, our emphasis and value on partnership is the key to unlocking law's potential. There are the victories you can secure in court, but before you ever get there, if you design your work in a manner that is consistent with what grassroots organizations are pushing for already, that supports their agency and that supports their forms of seeking justice, that you're far more likely to nudge things in the right direction. So you learn to manage your expectations and say, okay, law is not the answer, it's not the silver bullet, but it still plays an important role. And we see this in our work on a continuous basis. From when we file a case and publicize it, we are storytelling. We're bringing visibility oftentimes to stories that have been buried. And in doing so, we're creating new spaces, new conversations. And that takes it out of something that was once maybe a localized issue, and we've internationalized it by pointing to a supply chain or a complicit actor or someone who's failed in their duties. And we tell a story that is far more, I think, engaging, because it shows that we're connected and it's not some faraway issue. And in the globalized economy and ecosystem in which we inhabit, that's really important, that reality is we're not disconnected. And indeed, everything, the economic order that we inhabit is perpetuating deep inequalities that drives a lot of the harms that we are collectively suffering from. And I mean, the climate is case in point. I think that's at the totem pole of that, the apex of that. But right down to, an indigenous community that's protecting its lands. We all have a stake in that. And our economic order is complicit in the destruction, oftentimes, of those lands and forests and resources. So that's where I think that law, when we look at it as a tool for mobilization, a tool for mutual empowerment, and a part of a broader strategy, I think we can really unlock its potential.
Brilliant. And I suppose GLAN, the organisation, it goes a long way in sharing those stories of inequality and injustice. And I mean, anybody who's interested in the work, you really go into detail with all of your cases that you've covered and any of the campaigns that are ongoing. And just, Gearóid, for anyone listening who might be inspired by your work and might be considering a career in law, especially in human rights law and the issues that you cover, what advice would you give them, and maybe what are kind of the challenges, some of the bigger challenges that they might have to prepare for?
I would say that there's no one road towards this work. And our team, I'm just thinking of the likes of, some of our staff members who have gone into the corporate sector and seen the proverbial light come back, that they bring with them amazing skill sets and know-how. And I think if you're interested in practicing in this area of law, like we're really interested in the likes of, how banks are complicit with human rights issues and environmental harms, how stock markets are advertising companies who are raising capital to do more destruction. We're really interested in suing them. And we're interested in, all the ways in which we can, creatively deploy the law. So having these expertise in these niche areas or other skill sets in terms of practice is a huge benefit for human rights, getting involved in human rights legal action. And so I would say just diversity of thought is important in this area. Creativity and storytelling plays a huge role in this. So for people who are non-lawyers who are interested in coming in, I think they have a significant role to play. And I think it is about just following, it sounds cliche, but just following your motivation. For me, it was just automatic. I was almost predestined to do this in one respect, just because I told you early on, I was exposed to certain stories, and I had a consciousness that was given to me by others, and it became something that was just very automatic and fulfilling. And with that energy, if you can follow that energy, it propels you a good deal of the way. I would say it's sort of 80% of the way. And you then figure out how to make it work if you give it space. And I think that's what our journey in GLAN has told us. We didn't really have a roadmap in building this. There was no real example of a dedicated transnational practice. Of course, there is the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights in Germany. I think they were a big inspiration for us, but we really had to figure out how we carve this path, make a lot of mistakes, and still with our team, we're figuring it out together. We're encountering new challenges. We're growing, learning as a team too. We reflect the world we're trying to change, and we have to address our own inadequacies and overcome things and practical hurdles. But once you've got that energy and enthusiasm and you tap into it, it really is the fuel that makes this a reality. I would also say to encourage your students to encourage your law school to bring these into your career days, and not just to be exposed to corporate law and private practice. For those of you interested in challenging the status quo, that is important, and that those career paths are highlighted as much as those in the private sector.
Absolutely. Well, following that energy is crucial. And just back to the organisation in terms of how maybe finally our listeners can support your work, and how can they maybe get involved or contribute?
We have on our website, glanlaw.org, you can sign up to our newsletter. Sounds like a very boring way to contribute, but it would give you a front row seat into our work. We engage with that newsletter to inform people of cases as we file them, how they progress. And of course, there's the usual ways. We try and engage people through crowdfunding as well, and we give really detailed updates and bring people along on a journey, and make people feel part of the development of a case. And as this happens on our social media channels as well, we try and identify ways, oftentimes via our partners, of which people can actually mobilize with this work and support it. And I think they're the sort of the inroads into sort of figuring out how to support our work, disseminate the message, increase the reach of our stories. That's just the first step. And then for those who are interested in working with us, that's where we also regularly advertise vacancies and opportunities. We work closely with the Irish Centre for Human Rights here in Galway on a placement scheme. So those of you studying law in Galway, in the LLM, we try and interact directly and bring students onto our cases, and we interact with law schools around Europe and North America as well to bring people on directly into our work. So we regularly receive requests on for internships and fellowships and otherwise. So yeah, definitely our site is a place to watch there.
It really is, and I can certainly vouch for the newsletter, so I would encourage anybody who's listening to this episode to sign up. It's incredibly resourceful and informative and detailed, so please do that. Well, Gearóid, thank you so much for joining me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, sir.
Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team, using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.